something happens and you panic. You see something, somebody says something to you, and you feel triggered. Well, that is what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to episode 89 of the Positivity Experience, unboxing your triggers and starting to face them. Check it out. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 89 of the Positivity Experience. It's your girl Lori, and man, I'm excited to be back with you guys. It is starting to feel a smidgen like fall. I don't know that I would say it's fall yet, but in the evenings it's starting to feel good. I'm starting to love that. So I wanted to give a huge shout out to our newest Patreon members, Rhonda Bingham, at our gratitude level, and at our abundance level, we have outdoor adventures with Jason. Doesn't that seem like we should all call Jason and say, hey, Jason, let's go on some outdoor adventure. That just sounds fun. And also Lenora Shelton. So a huge shout out to you guys. I love you guys and welcome aboard. If you are on the Patreon this upcoming week, we're going to do the Kahoot game where we, I'll do giveaways, and it's just a fun little thing. If you want to know what the Patreon is, it's the toolbox version to the podcast itself. So it gives you the tools on based whatever we're talking about, helps us offset some of my individual podcasting costs. So it's really great. And that's always in that link to that is always in the show notes. So that's the description of the podcast. So with that being said, I am so excited for today's topic. I'm always excited for the topics. What can I say? But it's going to be on triggers because I hear this a lot about triggers. And I think you guys know I'm always going to tell you in the long run is to always face those triggers. But first you have to acknowledge what triggers you. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about a trigger. I mean, for the most part, everybody kind of knows what a trigger is, right? And it's let's say, you've had an experience with something, whether it be cheating, whether it be with a car accident, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it is. And you might not even know that you're being triggered until you are. You're out, you're having a great time. You hear a skirt and then a crash, and it all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, it just kind of takes you DNA wise, DNA. I don't know why I said DNA. It takes you mentally back to the site of your trauma. You're like, oh my God, that brought it back. So that lets me know hey, you know what? You haven't fully processed it. And it's also normal to say, oh, this reminds me of something. So I know a lot of you know that I work with a lot of Vietnam veterans. And with the Vietnam veterans, even though a lot of them weren't over there for a long period of time, the things in which they saw and experienced, and this was there was a lot of bad stuff happening. And, they've gotten really in depth on things that they had seen with me. And so there's sometimes for them, if they smell dirt in a certain way, and I know you're like, dirt. Yeah. So when things were being dropped, when bombs were being dropped, it was a smell of a certain smell apparently that they tell me about when it comes to the dirt. And so when they smell that, it almost takes them right back there. So a lot of that is based on your PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So your triggers based on your I'm not saying everybody has PTSD. I'm just saying you're like, oh my God, this reminds me of it. So I wanted to talk a lot about the triggers because a lot of times you're afraid to do something because you're afraid to be triggered. But the reality is life doesn't stop because you don't want to be triggered. Now, it doesn't even have to be that serious. It could be, I'm triggered, I'm angry because you didn't do something the way I thought you should do it, right? That could trigger you. Well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Oh my God, that's terrible. Why didn't you do it this way? Oh, okay. Well, they didn't have to. So you can also be triggered by other people's actions that you can't accept are their actions and how they do something, and it may not align with how you do it. And that's okay. So there's a few things to identify when you have a trigger, and I'm also going to do a good exercise with triggers over on the Patreon for the members over there. But first of all, you have to identify that a trigger is always going to pretty much be there, but it's what kind of life are you going to give it? Now, I want to be very clear. I don't want you to start just going to face your triggers before you've started to process your stuff. That's not a good idea. That's you running the sprint, not the marathon. You're trying to get to the end. You don't want to be triggered anymore. You don't want to have these feelings anymore. So you want to just process it. Okay, well, you're not maybe emotionally ready to do that yet. So we have to first go back to the site of what that trauma is, work you through that trauma, start to release your ego, start to release the level of hold that the ego has on you. And you're allowing your ego to take over by saying, well, I don't like this, made me feel said thing. Well, your feelings aren't facts. So it can make you feel that way, but that doesn't mean that that person is wrong. So this can still be a trigger. It doesn't have to be something that's PTSD based. It could be based in ego. So your ego can cause you to be triggered multiple times, and often more than your PTSD, because you're like, well, I don't like that. I don't like that. I feel wronged. I feel slighted. Okay, well, if you feel slighted and it is what it is, then that's for you to process. Now, if it really doesn't align with you, you can distance from it. That's fine. But don't judge it. Because when you're triggered, now you want to judge it. Now you want to blame the trigger. But there's no blame to be put anywhere. Right? Now, when you are in your emotions, right? Because it's all about how your emotions lie. And I will repeat this frequently, that thoughts and feelings are not facts. And I will live there forever. That is the facts. This does not invalidate your feelings. This is to say those feelings are real to you in that moment, but they are only real to you. You are the only person who needs to validate them. Just because you're feeling some kind of way does not mean that a person has to respond based on your feeling state. And that can trigger you. Because now you're like, well, I don't understand. Like, don't they see I'm having a bad day? Well, why do you think that it's their job to fix it? So you have to retrace and go backwards. Like, okay, I feel triggered. I feel mad. I feel upset. What led to this situation? Okay, so in that case, well, this person didn't call me, or this person canceled on me, or this person ghosted out on me, or what? Okay, so you need to know the why. Okay, so now that you know the why, and you're in that space of the why, where is it that you feel as though you have to hold on to it? That you have to hold on to that feeling to protect yourself, right? So that, again, goes into ego, because now if you're constantly sitting in a space to protect yourself, and you're just living there in that space of protection, you're never going to fully allow yourself to live, because you're always going to be waiting and avoiding the triggers. It's triggered, like somebody, so like in my house, there's a lot of yelling and stuff. So years ago, now I don't really have many triggers anymore, to be honest with you, because I've processed them. And I know that if it triggers me, I'm going to go headfirst into it. But I'm in a whole different space. That comes with emotional maturity, a lot of practice, a lot of wellness. So I know if I'm uncomfortable with something, it's not like I'm not walking around uncomfortable with things. I'm going to go headfirst into it. I'm not going to avoid it and run from it. Because you have to remember, what you're running from will continue to chase you. I don't care if you had $50 million, life was quote unquote great. Your issues and things that you haven't processed, and your fears or your traumas and triggers, will follow you anywhere you are. Anywhere you are, there you are. So you can't run from yourself, number one. So you have to go back and say, okay, why did this trigger me? And it could be something that your mom did. I don't know. Your mom always said that she'd do something and then didn't. So now you have a friend and you're kind of like really hardcore into your friendship, and your friend says, yeah, I'll do this. And then at the last minute, they're like, no, I can't do it. Doesn't matter. You don't need to know their why. Now you're like, oh my God, this is happening again. Now we go into cognitive distortion. So triggers and cognitive distortions often go hand in hand. So a cognitive distortion is literally what it sounds. It's a distorted way of thinking. So now this person, this friend in this fictitious situation, this friend has said to you, you know what? I can't make it. And you're like, okay, no problem. And then you hang up the phone. You're like, I can't believe this. This always happens. The moment you use always, the moment you use never, you are in cognitive distortion. And it's also called a mental filter. This is all part of like a DBT practice as well. But it's like part of a mental filter. And I say, like, if you, I don't know, you're walking out the house, you break the heel of your shoe. Like, say you're in heels, I don't know, you twist it, the heel of the shoe comes off. Now you're like, oh, this has just set the tone of the day. The whole day is going to suck. Okay, well, yeah, it absolutely is, because you just literally told yourself that it was going to. Absolutely, that's true. So when you're in that space, you have to remember that that's a cognitive way of thinking. So now the friend that said, hey, not going to be able to make it, and like not ghosted out, but basically in your mind, your perspective, was that they just like took you to the last minute and then canceled on you. And now you're like irritated. You're mad because this quote unquote always happens to you. No, it doesn't. And honestly, you will breathe life into that. So if you're like, it always happens, you're going to always attract that. You do realize the universe does not care what you want and don't want. It is not an emotional thing. It's going to give you what you focus on, whether you write it down or you hold it in your head. Does not care. So the more you ask for it, the more you're breathing it into a self-fulfilled prophecy. And that's just how that is. So you have to allow yourself to have your feelings. It's kind of like some people get triggered, honestly, if, I don't know, maybe you and this person had a tiff and the person goes, hey, I'm sorry that you feel that way. And you think, well, what do you mean? I'm sorry you feel that way. That's weird. Why don't you just say sorry? Okay, so now you're trying to, but the person might not be sorry. The person may not feel as though their response was wrong. You're not any more right than they are. But if they're like, hey, I'm sorry you feel that way, that's your feelings, but they don't have to apologize. But people get triggered. A lot of people get triggered when people say, I'm sorry you feel that way, because somehow or another they feel as though they're being, I don't know, manipulated in some way. And no, they're just being honest. A person's like, oh, I'm not going to apologize for what I did. Sorry you feel like that, basically is what they're saying. So you have to retrace your steps to understand where it comes from. So if it's a mom issue, because mom always said that she would do it, and now all of these things are happening, okay, well, no. You know, and you have to understand, people ask me all the time, like, will a trigger go away? I mean, absolutely. You know, the reaction to your trigger could go away. I mean, they're never just going to disappear. You're never just going to be like, that doesn't bother me anymore. I will say it loses power. So I look at things that used to be triggering to me, and I mean, trust me, I have a list of triggers. I have a whole chapter that I'm doing in the book on it. But, you know, I did have a list of triggers. Now I don't. People are like, oh my God, that didn't bother you? No, because I accept everything as it is what it is, right? If you don't like the way I practice, then it is what it is. You don't have to rock with it. But your opinion of it doesn't affect the way that I think. It doesn't affect me as a person. And so that again comes with emotional maturity by releasing it. But you can absolutely diminish the reaction to your emotional trigger. It will subside. Okay. But you have to identify it and then choose your actions, what to do next. Because if you live in it and go, this always happens. Here I go again. This, I knew it. The moment I let my guard down, here, this happens. It always does. This goes back into cognitive distortion. It doesn't always happen. No, it doesn't. Well, every single relationship. So every single relationship that you have, from a friendship, from a coworker, every single one of them treats you the exact same way. No. Then don't say it always happens. So this comes into a reconstruction of what that trigger is, right? And so, you know, when you're doing it, and understanding, you know, to like not respond out of reaction. So people say, well, when you're in that reaction of the trigger, well, you always have your breath. Always, always, always. You always have your breath until you don't, right? But so your breath is where you do your box breathing. Inhale for 4 and think of a beautiful color. Hold it, change colors. Exhale, change colors, and then breathe normal. Do that. What it does is because when you go into fight and flight and you start thinking and panicking and feeling unsafe, and that's another reminder while you're breathing, this is not the past situation. This person in this situation is not the exact same, because it can't be, because you can't go back in time. Okay. Now, another thing to do while you're breathing, distract yourself from it. You know, just go, you know what? I'm going to go for a walk. One of the biggest things in DBT practice is, you know what? Sometimes you have to get that energy out. Maybe you move fast. Maybe you do some exercise. Always go to your negative journal. Always go into that journal. Always. But, you know, distract yourself and then remind yourself, hey, you know what? This is a trigger. Identify it for what it is. Don't be like, oh my God, this is a trigger. Let's not stop making the trigger giant. The trigger is exactly what it is just reminding you of a past situation. So be clear what a trigger is. It is something that elicits an emotional response, physical or emotional response, based on an experience that you've had. That's exactly what a trigger is. So you have to say, okay, and give yourself that little mantra. I am safe. I am mentally safe. This is an old thought pattern. These are areas I'm still working on. And you can't run from your feelings. I have a whole podcast and a whole series on feeling your feelings. And when I say feel your feelings, isn't like I'm scared, I'm in fear, I'm upset, I'm angry. No. Those are describer words. How do you feel it in your body? How do you feel it in your soul? How do you feel it in your, is your heart racing? Do you feel numb? Do you feel paralyzed? What do you feel? See, people try to process their feelings by just putting an adjective to it. I'm sad. So what's that mean? Well, I'm sad. No, I don't know what sad means to you. I know what sad means to me. Okay, so you could say, I feel heavy. I feel like I could cry at the drop of the hat. I feel like I'm walking through quicksand. Whatever the case may be, but you gotta feel it. Because if you don't feel it, and if you keep avoiding the trigger, now this is the other part of it, and that's because I do a lot of exposure work, right? When my clients are ready, we do a lot of exposure therapy, meaning if you fear it, we're gonna do it. Yes, I know you're gonna feel like you're dying, but you're not dying. You're going to realize, oh my God, on the other side of this, I can do this. But the more you avoid it because you're afraid to face it, the more it imprisons you, right? I do that a lot with my agoraphobic clients, right? And agoraphobia is where not only can sometimes you not leave the house, but then you can only go in a certain radius if you do leave the house. And there's all these rules. And trust me, agoraphobia is a whole thing. And I have a lot of clients who have totally gotten out of the agoraphobia. They are living their best lives. And did so because over a very short period of time, we do a little prep work, and then we went straight into okay, you're getting out of the house. Oh my God, no, I don't want to hear it. You're going to get out of the house, and we do it together, right? So I don't allow you to allow yourself to give in to the trigger, but don't do that now. Don't try to jump out the box and do that now when you haven't started to do the work to understand that those triggers don't have power over you unless you give it to them. So of course you're going to, be triggered by certain things. Like I said, over a period of time, right, is you allow yourself to minimize it. So think of the big giant, like the Jolly Green Giant, and that's what your trigger is. And you're like, oh my God, it's so big and so scary. And then as you start to process it, you start realizing, wait, it's not as big as I thought it was. And then it starts to get so tiny, you just look at it and go, oh yeah, okay, I remember what happened here. And some people say, well, how do I know that I'm being triggered? Because most of us think that your triggers. Well, if something happens and you go into anger, if you have fear, if you start with anxiety, all of a sudden you're super sad. You're numb, or you definitely feel like, oh my God, I'm completely out of control. You feel over analytical. You feel as though, you have to lash out. You have to get the last word. You have to prove a point. Believe it or not, that's a trigger. See, people think of triggers as just being things from PTSD. If you're constantly an angry person, if you constantly feel like people are slighting you and you need to prove a point, you're being triggered. And it's not the person or thing's issue that is triggering you. It's a deeper issue for you to process. And so that's why you have to be careful about isolating yourself and avoiding it. Stop avoiding triggers. We're not going to be avoiding triggers. Again, not in the immediate, but you don't avoid them by isolating and forgetting it. You do not become argumentative. I will let you talk to a blank space. And that's what you have to understand. Let someone win the day. 2 + 2 is 9. Yes. Why do you feel the need to be so argumentative? If you're argumentative and you need the last word, you are constantly in a state of trigger. But you now are allowing that state of trigger because you need to be heard because as a child you weren't heard. Well, that's not this person's issue. That's old stuff that you have to process, right? So being argumentative and defensive is absolutely a trigger. But then when you're the argumentative one, or you're the short-tempered one, or you're the short whatevered one, okay, you don't realize that you think you're protecting yourself, but you're actually putting that on other people. And then they're going to be like, I ain't got time for this right now. or you'll become physically aggressive. You'll start throwing things. You'll start doing all of these things. Absolutely not. That's just your way of not processing your stuff. Anger comes from fear, frustration, and hurt. Anything that you are angry about rolls into one or all three of those. Fear, frustrations, or hurt. You're frustrated that things didn't go the way you planned it. You're frustrated that things keep changing. You're frustrated that those things happen. Okay. You still have to process it. Those situations aren't going to change, right? Or you'll just shut down completely. You'll just be like, okay, whatever. It's whatever. Like you start with the whole, I don't care. Now, I literally don't, I think me practicing a Buddhist lifestyle has been very helpful because you learn very quickly that nothing is really everything's temporary. Like you're temporary, everybody around you is temporary. Things people say is a reflection of them, not you. Your actions based on their responses is a reflection of you, not them. Like there's a combination of putting down your ego and accepting things for being what they are. So it's about allowing yourself so really it's going to take, and like someone do this over on Patreon, but a little exercise here for you guys is to allow yourself to take stock of every time that you get triggered. Take stock of how it lands in your body, because you got to be careful of allowing the actual PTSD and lack of responding, because you're learning to respond to it, right? As you're healing it. You got to allow that, but you don't allow the victim mentality. Two different things. If you know you're like, oh my gosh, I'm triggered and I feel myself getting angry. I see this, but I'm working towards something. Then you're doing it in a productive state. That's fine. But if you're like, well, the world owes me this because I'm me, or, I had a rough childhood, or this happened to me. Don't people understand? Well, now we're in a victim mentality. So now that trigger becomes the trigger that you're triggered by now creates your actions to trigger other people. Now, it's not your responsibility on what triggers people or doesn't, but I'm just giving you the trajectory of how that goes, right? So you get aggressive, you get distant, you get like, well, this is how it is. You get despondent, you get whatever it is. And then another person gets triggered by that and they have a reaction to it. And now you go, well, what is wrong with you? And they go, what do you mean? Well, why are you acting like that? Well, you just came at me aggressively. Well, yeah, I did come at you because don't you understand, da, 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 da. Okay, so now you just doubled down on it, did it again, and now you're mad at somebody for responding to how you reacted, which triggered them. So if you trigger someone and now suddenly you're blaming that person that you're triggered because of your actions, now that becomes that vicious cycle. Now you're the victim mentality person. And that's what you have to be careful of. You have to kind of curb that idea that your trigger is like the only thing that exists on the planet and that everybody else should understand this. That goes into entitlement. That goes into victim mentality, right? So going back into the trigger state of it, right? Identify what it is. Get clear as to the why, because your initial trigger, Stephanie down the street who triggered you because she said something to you, it's not Stephanie. Stephanie didn't trigger you. It's an underlying understanding that you still have things to process. When you're triggered, so you're triggered, like I said, by the car accident or whatever. You're triggered because you were in a car accident. I've been in car accidents. And, you're triggered. You're afraid to do it. Okay, now you started to process it. Now you're feeling some kind of way. Now suddenly there's a little tiny fender bender. Nothing crazy. And you're like, God, I knew it. Like I knew this was my biggest fear. Okay, now we're catastrophizing. And now we're blaming the little fender bender for throwing you back into a PTSD response of something that you still haven't processed. So it becomes misplaced triggering, misplaced anger, misplaced frustration. Because when you're misplacing it, right, the whole idea, you're triggered by something because it's not the initial sight. A trigger isn't just one time and it happens. A trigger means that it's bringing back an old emotional response or a memory of something that happened in the past that really wasn't all that great for you. That's what a trigger is. So you want to be mindful of it, okay? Because, you're going to have an initial reaction, right? Like I said, you could be, upset and angry and numb and confused even, and super tired and burned out. I mean, it comes across this all the way across the board. But remember, that is self-limiting for you. You are doing that. This is not blaming. I'm trying to make it to where you understand what it is. But you're allowing yourself to get caught in a trauma cycle. So now you're re-traumatizing yourself based on the initial trauma. So the initial trauma, which is not your responsibility, has now become your part of your identity. So you are self-limiting yourself by avoiding them and not processing it. So like I said, you have to be careful because it goes into, it's one thing if you're healing it and you're trying to process through it, beautiful. But if you're trying to hold on to it and then expect the world around you to respond how you choose them to respond to, well, now we're going into that victim mentality area. So that's the whole concept of triggers. And people try to avoid them because they're uncomfortable. But as you guys know, I mean, a lot of you know, I mean, that's a huge part of what I do is exposure therapy. What you don't like, we're going to do. And that's the whole thing because you are giving life to these triggers. You are doing that. You are giving them life by giving them this big jolly green giant that says, oh my God, this is a trigger for me. Loud noises, people arguing is a trigger. Yeah, that just means that you have to process still. A trigger can be a great thing because a trigger can let you know where you still need to work, right? Stop looking at triggers as all bad. Look at a trigger and go, oh my God, I really realize I'm still triggered by this. I really have more to go back and do. Because so many people say, I'm fine. I've healed my stuff. And then they're still triggered. And I go, no, you haven't. Nope. Because truly, when you have healed it, the trigger may still be there, but your emotional response to that trigger will not. So that's a really good indicator as to where you are in your healing journey. Right? I want you to be very mindful of that. Where you are in your healing journey can always be gauged and seen by how your responses are to outside forces that you can't control and to the triggers themselves. So don't just avoid a trigger because you don't like it and you think it's an awful thing. It can be a beautiful thing if you allow it to. There's always something positive if you choose to seek it. If you choose to not seek it, well, you'll never find it. But you have to understand that when you're in that trauma zone and you're in that trigger zone, sometimes you're not thinking clearly. And that's why you have to pause. You want to respond and not react. And sometimes that means you got to step back. You got to go to that negative journal. You got to process it. You got to make sure you're doing it in therapy and coaching, in your self-help. You got to make sure that you're processing it. Don't just come out the box. If somebody wants to win the argument, let them. Yep, they won the argument. Doesn't make you less than. You get power from that. You get your power back because you give your power away when you're trying to avoid things and situations and, be angry. You're giving your power away. And that's the important imperative thing. Imperative? I don't know. That's the important thing. Imperative. That's the word. I was like imperative. I don't think that's right. Imperative. So it's imperative that you understand that. So while you are, like I said, you don't just come out the box and go into your triggers because you have to start to address what the deeper rooted issue is. Okay, you have to start to address that. And I know it's not about going back and living in the past, but stop thinking that you can just tackle everything at 40, okay, and be like, okay, well, yeah, that was my past and like I'm done with it. No, you're not. Because if you were done and truly healed through it, you would not have an emotional response to triggers. So stop saying that you've gotten through it. That's denial, right? You're like, well, I mean, it's no big deal. Like I've gotten through it. Yeah, you got through it, but you haven't gotten through it and over it. Two different things. That's a really good gauge for you to know where you are with your triggers is where you are in your healing process. So if you're constantly being triggered, then of course you still have more work and you should always have work to do. You should never be so content in your life that you feel like there's no room for growth, ever. Ever, never. Okay? Now that's one place I will say never, because you won't ever reach your full potential in this lifetime. But that shouldn't be discouraging. That should give you lots of things to keep working towards it. So, you can always book a session with me or book a session with somebody, but you need to make sure that you're processing your stuff. Stop avoiding the things. Stop avoiding your fear. Your fear is just a trigger. That's all that is. Your fear is lying to you. It's false evidence appearing real. It feels real. It's in your DNA. You feel it. You can feel it in your heart rate. You can feel it everywhere. Doesn't mean it's real. Does not mean it's real. There's a deeper underlying issue that needs to be addressed. So that's the spiel on triggers. We're going to go over there and do a little exercise on it. But you guys, seriously, you can get your power back. I promise you can. But you got to be willing to be vulnerable. You got to be willing to go back through your past. You got to be willing to relive certain areas and situations in your past that you know that now you're safe. And then and only then can you start to heal it to where you're no longer running from those triggers.